Hi, I'm Mark Robertson, and I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. It's a new YouTube channel. I call it simply Mark Robertson Talks. I will be giving regular talks on a wide range of subjects. And the first talk I gave was on prayer in the schools, and taking it out of schools was such a disaster. And today's topic is similar. It's just government schooling in general and all the problems I have with that. Government schooling has brought great harm to young people and to society in general. Before public schools came about in the mid-1800s, the kids were educated largely at home. There were one-room schoolhouses, but the results were much better. The young people were much better read, much more literate, and they had a much better understanding of history, of many of the subjects, and they were much better taught. And the family was together. And then along about the mid-1850s, a guy named Horace Mann came along, and if you're going to control the kids and create a utopian society, you can't have strong families and you can't have smart kids. You got to dumb them down. So we got to start teaching these kids and indoctrinating them in public schools. So he actually brought the public school system from Prussia. And believe it or not, Prussia inherited it from the United States. There was a guy named Robert Owen. He started a commune. Yes, that's where they get the word communist. In Indiana, called it New Harmony, Indiana. And he wanted to create this utopian society there. And he didn't like the idea that families were teaching their kids, basically the basic educators as their kids. So he wanted to start these schools where he could bring these kids in and basically get God out of schools and just teach them in a secular, humanistic way, basic subjects and things like that. If you're going to control the kids and the family, you have to attack the family and indoctrinate the kids. So that's what he wanted to do. And he actually exported this to Prussia. And then, like I said, Horace Mann brought it here to the United States, and he established essentially the public school system in the mid-1850s. And he said that he just didn't want schools to be associated with religious entities such as churches and things like that. But he said you can still teach biblical morality in schools. Well, he was trying to appease the Christians, and knowing in the long run this would not work, and he wanted to eventually phase that out as well. So it was basically like a Trojan horse. But he had very devious plans in mind. And but that's basically how public schools started. Then in the late 1800s, John Dewey came along and made it even worse, took it even to a higher degree of secularism. And he was basically a communist, and he admired the communist system and how kids were educated there. And he was a big fan of Karl Marx and things like this. And so he wanted to basically break down the family. He wanted to diminish kids' individualism. He didn't even like the fact that reading, writing, and arithmetic and history were emphasized. He wanted to de-emphasize that. And he basically wanted to emphasize indoctrination. That's what the Prussian system was. It was first and foremost about indoctrination of kids. And they basically brought that here. And that's what government school was about from the beginning, indoctrinating and getting God out of schools. Now, it took them to about 1962 to officially do that, but that was their goal all along. And that's basically was why we're in the trouble we are today. It's basically a basic background of it. But John Dewey wanted to teach kids socialism and wanted to brainwash them and get them to the idea of liking socialism. And that's how they work. He basically wanted a collectivist system in our school system, and that's what he's got. Today's public school system is just that. And it's been a long time in the making, but basically started in the 1850s, and here we are today. We've got a government school system. You can't teach right and wrong. What are you going to base right and wrong on? It's just the whims of the day. That's why we have transgenderism, being taught that a child can actually change his sex. Oh, the Bible says God made them male and female. Well, we got to get rid of the Bible. We got to control these people. All these crazy ideas that come about, the sex education, the perverted sex education was basically brought to us by a guy named Alfred Kinsey, who was a pedophile degenerate, and also was about control and indoctrination. And then Planned Parenthood is behind that as well. Got to get these kids sexually active, because then the girls will become pregnant and they'll need abortions. It's about money as well. So it's just devious what has happened to our public schools. And but like I say, John Dewey was about, like all good communists, he was about tearing down family values and tearing down religion, getting religion out of the picture. And but then he wanted to use education like this was a great thing and really a great advancement in society. It was all a fraud and a sham. Orestes Bronson, he was a New England writer and editor, and he originally favored the idea of government schooling, but began to see through it and realized that it was just all about an attack on religion. And he became then a big critic of public schools and a defender of traditional values in the family. And a lot of people did see through it. Like we mentioned, Karl Marx, government schooling was one of Karl Marx's 10 points in his 10-point plan in the Communist Manifesto. So that basically says it all. Government school is about control. It's about indoctrination. Yes, they teach subjects, but first and foremost, it's about control. That's why they don't teach accurate history. That's why you see all the craziness in society. There's really nothing to base right and wrong on. And nearly 85% of kids in the country go to some form of public school. And yes, government school has a dubious past, and we talk about that. But what is it? You get these kids going into these big complexes every day in these schools, and they sit in these classrooms, and the teacher's up in front of the class. There might be 40, 50, 60, 70 kids in a class. Whatever subject it is, they're taught. If it's history, a lot of times it's not real history. But no matter the subject, another situation is the learning going on in these schools. Are they actually learning? I mean, you see these results. Recently, it was pointed out that in Baltimore, there were 13 public schools that there was not one student, 13 public high schools, not one student proficient in math at that grade level that they were in. I mean, that's insanity. And they had one of the highest per student spending rates in the country. So they throw all this money at it. It's just a huge government bureaucracy is what government schooling is. And like all government bureaucracies, it doesn't work and doesn't work as intended. And there are other motives going on here and a lot of other things happening other than the main goal of what it should be, educating children in basic learning, reading, writing, arithmetic, and actual history and actual science and things like this, rather than all the agendas flying around. And these kids are in these schools and they should be learning. Now, some of the kids do adapt to this and they can memorize good, they can take notes, and they can turn in tests, and they can do standardized tests. That's another thing. The standardized testing sham is just all not real as well. It is real. I mean, they know subjects, they learn things, but it really doesn't relate to future activity and future qualifications in the real world. These are just things that they use for temporary achievements and things like this. And I'm not saying it's totally wrong, but it's just way overemphasized. And a lot of times these kids that do well on it don't do well on other things in the real world and things like that. But what happens if a young person doesn't conform to these teaching ways? Well, there must be something wrong with them. So we better put them on these psychotic drugs that make them even more disgruntled, more unhappy. It's just an endless spiral downward in craziness. Some kids are not meant to sit in a room all day in a chair, take notes, and regurgitate what they've learned. Some kids need to run around. I mean, the young boys can't just sit there all day. It actually is harmful for them. There are different ways to learn. There are different learning styles. There are books written on the learning styles, and there's even more than written in those books. Everybody's individual, and they all learn in a different way. That's why homeschooling is successful, because parents can individualize their teaching. And not that this is an excuse to not put forth some effort, but there are definitely different ways to learn and more effective ways to learn for some kids and versus other kids. And public schools want everybody to conform. They treat everybody the same. And but if you're not the same, they even bring more harm to you. Like I say, they put you on some kind of crazy drugs that bring harm to these kids even worse, especially down the road. And it just leads to a lifetime of misery. And these kids, all of a sudden, they just get an inferiority complex about themselves that they have to be on these drugs. So that's part of the downward spiral. It's not good anywhere around. Then they get told, well, if they can't read right, they must have dyslexia. Well, what is dyslexia? That's just a word that was invented by people who don't have dyslexia. Dyslexia is not a disorder. It doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It's just that you have a different way to see the world. Many great inventors, scientists, artists, writers, or so-called dyslexic. But it's just a different view of things. They see things differently. They see what others can't see. They actually have an ability that many don't have. So it's actually an advantage in many ways. There's a book written called The Dyslexic Advantage, and I highly recommend it. It's a good book, and they have a whole organization around that. But it's not a disorder. But these kids then are told that there's something wrong with them. So right there, they are labeled as inferior. And so that kind of is a downward spiral as well. There's just so much ignorance going on and so much harm that is brought about in these public schools. These kids have talents that they need to be nurtured. And but then we talked about what they can be taught. We talked about history. History is rewritten as well. It's all political correctness now. Political correctness is a tyranny. It's a form of control itself. They really can't teach about the Pilgrims, because if you teach about the Pilgrims, you got to teach about religion. And religion is banned now in government schools, which is totally crazy. It never should have happened. It's unconstitutional. It's about control. It has nothing to do with offending people or things like that. It's about power and control and taking God out of the picture. Because if you do that, people are easier to control, and you can create that utopia. And I knew a fellow who was a teacher in an inner city school, and he said basically all he was an expensive babysitter. Kids don't learn. We talked about the schools in Baltimore, and but these kids are not defective either. A lady named Marva Collins, she has passed away a few years back, but she had these inner city private schools and brought all these kids from very poor backgrounds, and they shined. They did really well, individual attention, and so it's not that these kids in inner cities are inferior in any way. They just aren't properly nurtured, and they aren't properly taught. It's all like a factory. It doesn't work. It's impersonal, and they brought in and they make things worse. And it's compulsory though, so they're indoctrinated. It would almost be better off for these kids not going to school. They could go to the library, they could learn on the internet, or they could get a job doing something. They could learn the basic skills of reading and writing. But it's just really, it's crazy. And it's the establishment as well. In New York City, these public school establishment, they guard their territory fiercely, and they don't like competition. They don't like vouchers. Vouchers is not an ideal situation, but it would be a start in improving the schools. And you often find that the parents of inner city schools students are the biggest in favor of vouchers, but the government officials in those cities are paid by the teachers' unions and others, and the teachers' unions don't want vouchers because they don't want competition. But that would be the best thing for these students. Cardinal John O'Connor was the Catholic cardinal in New York, and he has since passed away, but this was back, I believe, in the 90s, and he went to the public school system in New York and said he would take, free of charge, the lowest 1% of performers in the public schools in New York and educate them free in the Catholic school system. And they turned him down. So that says it all. It's not about educating kids. It's about protecting their territory. It's about their education establishment. I mean, the industrial education establishment is a major factor as well. It's not about educating. It's about protecting six-figure jobs. It's about protecting jobs in general, teachers' jobs and things like this. And they lose the main focus of what they're there for, and that is to educate young people in a proper way. And it's just gotten so out of hand. And it's big government. I mean, whether it's the post office, whether it's the VA, or no matter what it is, with very few exceptions, is usually a quagmire and a disaster. And government schools are no exception. And God, it was taken out of schools, and it was replaced by birth control, bathroom confusion, from transgenderism, which is a fake thing. Read what Dr. Paul McHugh, retired from Johns Hopkins, has written about it. It's a mental illness, and it's either that or brainwashing, and it's crazy. And these people that urge kids to change their sex, it's insane. It's cruel. It's total child abuse, but yet it seems normal in today's government schools. And then they push what is called safe sex. That's another lie by the sex education industry, which is a sham and an evil in itself. Like I say, it was pushed by Alfred Kinsey, the degenerate pedophile, and also Planned Parenthood, is behind this, which they basically want to corrupt the minds of kids and get them started early in sexual promiscuity. And they bring all this in. They bring it into very young kids, starting in kindergarten. And they teach them, well, all these things that are so antithetical to the Christian faith, all this stuff related to sexuality and all this other nightmares. First of all, a kindergartner, first grade, and these kids shouldn't even be taught about that. They should be outside playing if they're not learning their basic skills in school. It's so insane, but it's all about indoctrination and harming these kids to their perverted ways of life. And no, they don't have to accept that. We don't have to accept that. Parents don't have to accept that. But more and more parents are refusing to trying to go against this, but they get shut down. They say parents basically don't even have a right to say what is taught in these schools. And it's just evil what is going on. And it's all about control, and they want to loosen the morals. And when you do that, it's you can control the kids, and that's what is going on. And then you have the Department of Education. That's another disaster. $70 billion a year. What do they do besides ruin education? It's worthless. Education should be local, all local. Even at the state level, states, we are 50 states, but it should be, even that might be too much, but just local education. It shouldn't be compulsory. Parents want to educate their kids, and compulsory education hasn't worked anyway, so it couldn't be any worse. And there's so many ways today to learn. The free market provides answers. There's volunteers. You can go to the library. You can even learn on your own. Abraham Lincoln had less than 1 year of formal education, and he was largely learned on his own, actually. He learned how to read. I'm sure his mom taught him how to read, but it's crazy. This education system is very harmful. It doesn't teach, and this is why homeschooling is becoming so popular, but yet they want to shut that down too. There was just a recent story about a woman named Elizabeth Bartholet at Harvard, and she's all panicked when they had this virus going on, that all these kids staying at home with their parents having to somewhat homeschool, and she didn't like that. She says these parents assert authoritarian control over their kids. Well, what on earth do they do when they go to government schools? That's all they do. It's all conformity, and they can be treated as individuals at homes, and no, it's not perfect, and yes, there are bad parents, but these people want to really wreck the family. It takes a village. No, it doesn't take a village. It takes a mom and dad and a family. And like I say, there are bad parents. There are bad families. But it is the way to go. And there's such an effort to undermine this because, like I say, it's all about power. It's all about control. It's what they do in totalitarian regimes. And there's a lot of people trying to protect their turf, the teachers' unions, all the education bureaucrats. They like the gravy train continuing to flow their way. And like we said, there are well-meaning teachers, and they actually try to do a good job, and they believe in what they're doing. But the overall system is a disaster. And when you can't teach right and wrong because you can't base it on anything, basically you have chaos. And all this stuff, this craziness, kids get confused. You hear about suicides of kids. They're just totally confused about things. There's no right and wrong. You can't teach them right and wrong because that might offend somebody. And, I'm not saying that sometimes it wasn't overdone in the past, really strict measures, but kids need to know right and wrong. Kids want to know right and wrong. They want discipline. They want to be pushed. Kids are all designed differently and built differently, but yet they want the best brought out of them. And this takes effort from all sides, from the parents, from teachers, and everyone. And but today's schools really don't do that. And there may be some exceptions, but overall, the public school system in the country is a disaster. It's not good, and it's getting worse. And the biggest thing is, like I say, you can't teach right and wrong. You can't teach biblical principles. And that defeats the whole purpose. The Northwest Ordinance was basically the charter for the areas west of the Appalachians. One of the major features was that kids in school would be taught right and wrong from the Bible. So the founders all knew this, that there's no such thing as separation of church and state. God has to be part of the schools, but today they're not. They're just a sterile environment of mishmash whims of what people think is right and wrong. You can't punish kids, not that you want to really punish them, but you want to get them on a right track. And sometimes that takes someone being firm. But how can you decide that if you can't tell them something's wrong? I mean, these sex education courses, for an example, well, we need comprehensive sex education because, not all kids are going to do the abstinence thing. Well, are all kids going to not smoke or do drugs or drive cars fast or not maybe do something crazy? Why is it just not able to teach right and wrong here? What that actually does is promote promiscuity, and sexual promiscuity among teenagers. Any sexual activity is nothing but a disaster. It's wrong. It harms them. It brings great harm to society, and they are a drag on the society and themselves. It causes nothing but harm. But they're taught in these sex education courses that that's an alternative. And if you're going to do that, just practice safe sex, which, like I say, is also a lie. It's just so much lie and corruption. Many lies and corruptions in government school and political correctness, and it just permeates the schools. They rewrite history. They bring great harm to the country. And like I say, I don't really think you can control or change these. I think you just have to phase out public schools, and I would recommend getting kids out of public schools if at all possible. They're not good. They bring great harm. And, in these sessions I'm not the expert. I'm kind of a generalist. I try to read about it and things like that. I'm not trying to come off as a expert of the field. I read the general things about them, but I do have a couple of experts here. One of them is the late John Taylor Gatto. He taught school for 30 years in New York and saw all the craziness in government schools and the second career, he was basically an advocate against public schools and all the harm, things like that. And he wrote a very famous book, The Underground History of American Education. I highly recommend that. You can go online on YouTube, read a lot of his talks. He's got one now I'm watching. It's like a 5-hour interview, almost more than that. It's really fascinating. I'm about 4 hours into it. He's got a lot of other things, other books. He's got a number of books out there, but he spoke for many years after his teaching career about all the problems he saw in public schools. And a gentleman I just came on to learn about is a gentleman named Alex Newman. And he's got a book called Crimes of Education, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. And it's online. I looked it up online. It's real expensive on the book cover, but you can get it as an electronic book, an ebook. So it came out in 2015. And so it may not be in print, but like I say, it's still an ebook at this point. And he's got a number of columns. He did a whole series of columns on the problems of government education and sex education in schools and things like that on the Epoch Times, EPOCH, and very great articles. And he's online too on YouTube. You can see his talks. But these two are really great resources for understanding all the problems in government schools. I highly recommend them. And I'm continuing to learn from them as well. But basically, like I say, I'm not sure what you can do. I don't think you can change public schools. It's basically broke at the foundation. Its foundational principles will not last because you can't teach right and wrong, because you can't base it on anything. And eventually you have chaos, which is what we have now in government schools. And kids are educated this way. They don't know the real history. They don't know much about reality. And this is why it's become a major problem. And, you even got in bullying in schools and things like that. We really can't even do much about that. I mean, they do, but then they say they take bullying to a whole different levels as far as you can't bully for someone's ideas on things like that are kind of far out. They even bullying should obviously be stopped, but then they even use bullying as to advance their cause as well, because you can't bully someone who is a transgender child. You shouldn't bully anyone, but then they do that to defend their other agendas as well. So it's just so many lies in government schooling and so much harm brought to kids. And one of my favorite philosophers, economists, is Thomas Sowell. And I'd like to end my talk today. I'll read a little quote from him, and then we'll end this session, our second session here on Mark Robertson Talks. It's been good to have you with us today. But here's from Thomas Sowell. Ours may become the first civilization destroyed not by the power of our enemies, but by the ignorance of our teachers and the dangerous nonsense they are teaching our children. In an age of artificial intelligence, they are creating artificial stupidity. Thomas Sowell, great man. He's the one to read as well. He's written on many subjects. Highly recommended as well. He writes about intellectuals and all kinds of economics books and things like that. Great man. But he knows the problems with the education system in our country as well. So thank you for being with us today. And we hope you enjoyed our second of our Mark Robertson talks. And we'll be back soon with another subject. So take care until next time.